صباح الخير, السلام عليكم, boker tov, shalom, buenos dias, and good morning. I'll be giving my talk in English, and if you have any issues with the speed of my language, please let me know. I will slow down. Okay, I tend to forget myself and I talk too fast. So, first of all, I'm glad to be here, and thank you to Anwar, Yasmin, Professor Gabrieli, and Progetto Palestina Collective, for inviting me to this important event to honor the memory of the Palestinian intellectual Edward Said and critically engage in various aspects of his legacy. This year marks the 15th anniversary of Said's death and the 40th anniversary of the publication of his seminal work, Orientalism. 2 weeks ago, actually, in Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Ramallah, and other cities, Palestinians also honored Said's memory by screening a documentary film about his life called Ourselves and Others. His wife, Mariam Said, also attended these events and spoke in the QA session about her late husband's life and work. I would like also to seize this opportunity to honor the memory of Vittorio Arrigoni, with the pro-Palestinian International Solidarity Movement, a guy who didn't shy about criticizing either the government of Israel as one of the worst apartheid regimes in the world, or Hamas for its abysmal record in human rights in Gaza, and for which he unfortunately paid with his life. I'm also honored to be on this panel with Ilan and Ruba. Ilan's work on the Zionist ethnic cleansing of Palestine, as well as his student Teddy Katz's work on the Tantura massacre, brings home to me personally painful, traumatic memories about the history of the disposition that my parents' families went through during the Nakba, or the Palestinian catastrophe of '48. In his introduction to Orientalism, which many of you are familiar with, I hope, and have read with your professors, Said invokes Gramsci's, another Italian intellectual, inventory of the infinity of traces that made up his personal experiences and that serve as his point of departure for the critical elaboration of what he calls the consciousness of what one really is, knowing oneself as a product of the historical process to date. Although I take different positions from Said on matters of what self is and consciousness and the role of experience in validating one's position of authority in the production of knowledge, it might be important for me, for a panel that deals with memory and identity, to recognize how this history of the Tantura massacre as a metonymic representation of the Nakba formed my particular history and experience. My mom's family, the Diknash, and my paternal grandmother's family, Tanji, lived all their lives in Tantura, a coastal Palestinian town whose name was, after the Nakba, changed into Hofdor. Actually, my mother was born in Tantura just a month before Jewish militia. The Haganah's 33rd Battalion, the 3rd Battalion of the Alexandroni Brigade, committed a massacre in Tantura on May 22nd and 23rd, only a week after the declaration of the independence of the State of Israel. According to the recorded testimony of 40 witnesses, the native residents of Tantura were marched to the beach, where the men were separated from the women and children. They were taken to a wall near the mosque, where they were shot in the back of the head. The mass grave that contains the bodies of these victims is located today under the main parking lot of the Tantura Hofdor beach. Many people from Tantura sought refuge in Firidis, a village about 5 kilos to the east from Hofdor, where I was born, and where my mom and dad also grew up. After the destruction of that village and the expulsion of many of its residents to different camps in the West Bank, which was then under Jordanian rule, and also to the Arab world. Some of my father's uncles lived in Syria and Lebanon. The cleansing, by the way, a term used at the time and made popular in Ilan's book, of Tantura, was a well-kept secret. Katz, Ilan's student, when he did his master thesis on the massacre, and Ilan's also own work on the Zionist ethnic cleansing campaign that led to the Nakba, were instrumental in breaking the silence about the Tantura massacre in the Zionist political and economic establishment, and for which Teddy Katz also has paid a really heavy price. Actually, Teddy had interviewed my maternal grandfather, Abu Fahmi, for his thesis, and much of the controversy about the events of what happened in Tantura centered around the truth of my grandfather's account, as if a seamless and coherent narrative of any traumatic event is really possible. At this historical juncture of the Palestinian struggle for freedom, I don't usually use the term Palestinian conflict or question. I like to call it the Palestinian struggle for freedom. It is important to note that speaking of these traumatic memories of the Nakba is not something of the past. Recent political events in Palestine have put the specter of the traumatic history of the Nakba in all its nightmarish and shattering magnitude back at the center of international politics, after a failed attempt to obliterate it from the world scene. And I mean, of course, you probably guess, Trump. After dealing two devastating blows to the Palestinians on the status of Jerusalem and the US aid to the Palestinian Authority and the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, the Trump administration announced in the last few days that it will move the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem on May 14, 2018, at least a year or two ahead of its original schedule. In reaction to the way in which the PA has rebuffed Trump and his administration as dishonest brokers in the so-called peace process in the post-Oslo era, and the way that the PA also snubbed Vice President Pence on his last Middle East trip, Trump is clearly adamant about thumbing his nose at the Palestinians. In its statement, the State Department made it clear that this move was meant to coincide with Israel's 70th independence anniversary. That is the 70th anniversary of the Palestinian, our Nakba. Although the date of Israel's original Independence Day fell on May 14, 1948, this year Israel is celebrating their independence, or its independence, on April 18th, not May 14th. Since according to the Jewish calendar, May 14th corresponds to the 5th day of the Jewish month of Ayar in the year of 5708. So some commentators argue that this is just another unhappy blunder on the part of the scandal-ridden Trump administration, and that this administration is unaware of the scheduling of Israel's public holidays. On the one hand, May 14th also commemorates the Truman administration recognition of the State of Israel. And we know Trump wants everything really bigger and more huge than any other president before him. On the other hand, there might be perhaps a more insidiously calculated rationale behind Trump's embassy move decision. The embassy move is actually meant to coincide with the commemorations of the 70th Palestinian Nakba, which falls on May 14th of every year, according to the Gregorian calendar. Hanan Ashrawi thus tweeted that they deliberately chose a tragic day in Palestinian history, the Nakba, as an act of gratuitous cruelty, adding insult to injury. On the Palestinian chief negotiator Saad Arkat, on his part, condemned the move as a provocation of the feelings of the Palestinian people, as well as of all Arabs, Muslims, and Christians around the globe. Clearly, Trump's anti-Palestinian politics is grounded in a total disregard for and cruel insensitivity and apathy to Palestinian history, narrative, and suffering. However, there might be three advantages for this position. And I'm serious. First, it inadvertently recenters the iconic meaning of the Nakba for the Palestinians everywhere, after it has been eclipsed by other regional and international tragedies. Second, it foregrounds the tragedy of what we call the ongoing Nakba. The Nakba happened in 1948, but it still goes on every day in Palestine. The Nakba of the Palestinian people that the Zionist settler colonial regime and Israel's apartheid politics continue to refine and accelerate through its expanding settlements, Judaization of Jerusalem, and the genocidal wars on Gaza that occur on a daily basis under the radar, away from the media spotlight. More importantly for me, Trump anti-Palestinian politics calls attention to the orchestrated regional and international campaign that aims at the liquidation of the Palestinian cause, obliterating it completely from the face of the earth and their struggle for freedom. What has been referred to in the news as the deal of the century. Am I going too fast or clear? Clear? Okay. Please stop me. I'm serious. Okay, thank you. Thank you for being honest. So I would like to talk a bit about Said and the Nakba, and mention briefly some of his thoughts about the importance of the Nakba and why we sort of honor Said today and his work on this issue. Edward Said's writing on the Palestinian question offer important conceptual tools to engage the geopolitical scene at this juncture of the Palestinian struggle for freedom more critically and help us develop his critique of Zionism and Western imperialism in new ways. First, throughout his writing, Said establishes the Nakba as the sign of the disaster for Palestinians. For him, the Nakba represents a traumatic rupture in the Palestinian collective consciousness, national memory, and historical narrative. In the Nakba, as you know, 513 villages and towns were depopulated or ethnically cleansed, and half of the Palestinian population, about 750,000 men, women, and children, were driven out and scattered in the exile of refugee camps. The ontological status of the Nakba as the truth of the Palestinian experience notwithstanding, Said also reflected on the epistemological ambiguity of foundational narratives. I mean, the Nakba happened. There's no dispute about that the Nakba happened. But how do we represent and talk about the Nakba? That is something that occupied Said, as well as many other Palestinian thinkers, intellectuals, artists, and critics. Writing makes it a little bit different to sort of talk about some of these historical events in a way that can transmit the truth of what happened. First of all, Said's work compels us to write back to the historical and political erasure, omission, the forgetting of the Nakba, and bring to the fore the meaning of the Nakba and its human dimension. Even though in his early celebrated trilogy on Palestine, Orientalism, and covering Islam, Said never actually used the term Nakba. He always used the term disaster or catastrophe. However, Said documented the iconic, important status that the Nakba occupied in Palestinian and Arabic literary, artistic, and cultural production, and alluded to it as its function as a master signifier and grand narrative in the Palestinian and Arab psyche. For example, in his foreword to Ghassan Kanafani's book, Palestine's Children, Returning to Haifa and Other Stories, Said notes that the Nakba, or what he referred to as the disaster of 48, has posited, quote, the scene itself as the very problem of Arabic literature and writing. So what is unique about Said's approach is that he insisted on foregrounding the human dimension of the disaster, this rupture, the break, in all of its existential dimensions. Said documented the extent of that existential threat that the Zionist colonial project posed to the totality of Palestinian society and to its inevitable destruction. Said thus writes that the Nakba, quote, heralded the destruction of our society and our dispossession as a people. That's after the last sky. He thus bemoaned the Palestinian loss to Zionism of their right even to have a history and a political identity. He also rejected the relegation of the Palestinian to the status of the unknown and unacknowledged victim, who even worse is a victim blamed not only for his or her disasters, but those for the others as well. Okay, so usually, like Hanan Ashrawi says, the Palestinians are the only colonized people and victims of the world that have to defend Israel usually and argue on behalf of Israel for the international community. Now, this collective dimension of the Nakba exists in tension with the lack of personal and libidinal investment on Said's part in his early life. Said documented the impact of the Nakba on his family, and he writes about it in different places, especially about his aunt. But Said confesses that he actually knew little about the Nakba at the time, since he was well sheltered in his formative years. And as he states in his introduction to Orientalism, the infinity of traces that I mentioned earlier, is embodied in his memories, not of the Nakba, but of him being an Oriental child. That's what he says. As the product of colonial education, rather than as a product of national catastrophe. Now, this tension between what Professor Gabriele mentioned about the individual and the collective, between the ontological and epistemological significance of the Nakba, also informs Said's position on the limits of memory and the work of retrieval, memory retrieval, in the narrative production of the Nakba. And After the Last Sky, for example, Said quotes Jabra Ibrahim Jabra, who's a Palestinian writer from Bethlehem, where I work and teach, who claimed that, quote, the textuality of memory, its ambiguity and innocence, requires sentences that correspond to the memory exactly. But, as Jabra says, no such sentences exist, and they would take years to produce. Imagine if you were to write your own biography, counting and recounting every little detail you do on a daily basis. How many volumes would it take you to do that? Can you even finish writing what happens to you in one day? So no such sentences exist, and they would take years to produce, with very doubtful results, adding that since the instruments of the present are insufficient, we can't get to the past. The Palestine of our memories, he adds, is still there because it is irredeemable and inaccessible. It has acquired the complex impersonal texture of an ancient wall. You can neither have it nor penetrate it. And this is, chimes in well with what Gabriele mentioned about the last dimension of what he said about Said's work, that sort of sense of loss that is inscribed in exile. Now, although Said rejects the language of postmodern theory, this passage slips into the same rhetoric that elevates textuality to a rarefied zone of idealized and pure text that is severed from the world or historical circumstances, something that he really fought against. So what I'm saying is basically, Said contradicts himself, like all of us, which is fine. And that's what we really need to account in our critique of his work. As a text, memory could be understood as a complex, unstable, and unpredictable site where the meaning of a past event is produced in the interplay of what Jacques Derrida would say, the endless deferral of signification, the play of linguistic differences, which Said also repeated. Apart from any authorial intent, and again, the issue of intention and intentionality from Said's phenomenological perspective is really important. The mediation of other memories, intertextuality, the way that he deals with Orientalism as a collective of different books and texts and discourses, and the determinations of social and cultural institutions and traditions. However, Said insisted on the worldliness, that is the materiality and situatedness of memory, the way he talks about consciousness, the way he talks about the text. And he calls for a consistent engagement with the link between the text and the world in which it is produced, and the power structures that made it possible and render it intelligible. Now, in a different paper, maybe a different occasion, I would have used a great film done by a young woman from my village, from Fridis. Her name is Ibtisam Maran. Did a great film, documentary called Paradise Lost, Al-Firdaus Al-Mafqood, in which he basically documents the way that people from Fridis respond to the history of the Nakba and the Tantura massacre in particular. All of these gaps and silences that render a seamless narrative, a coherent narrative of the Tantura or Nakba, really incoherent, full of gaps, which is really what I'm trying to say about how Said theorizes the idea of the Nakba. Now, to me, of course, this raises another question, critical question about Said's work. It's not really clear the extent to which this textualization of memory, or dealing with memory as a text, as something unstable, that something can be betrayed, that's something that is full of gaps, could belie Said's rejection of grand totalizing ideologies and concepts. He rejects these ideas like Orient, Islam, Arab mind, West, Zionism, American way of life, English literary tradition. All of these terms for him are problematic. Can we say the same about the Nakba? It's an important question to ask if we are going to apply his own theoretical tools, right, and concepts to his work. Should the Nakba as an epistemological construct, not as an ontological event, we're not questioning that the Nakba happened, but as an epistemological construct, can it also be dismissed, as he says, purely conceptual and a summational fiction, just simply words and ideas, which are constructed by an a posteriori act of will, as he says? These tensions in his work are important, since they clear a critical space for rethinking history and memory beyond the traditional Manichaean narratives, that is, self against other, that Said rejected, and that inform really the history of ethnic cleansing in Palestine. My second major point this morning is about Said's approach to Zionism. In his writings on Zionism, which allows us again also to look at Trump's anti-Palestinian politics in the context of how Said analyzed Zionism itself, but also extend it, move further. In the question of Palestine, for example, Said examines Zionism in two ways. On the one hand, he talks about the genealogy of Zionism by demonstrating the affinities and links between its ideological edifice and other ideological systems and political institutions, especially Western imperialism and colonialism. On the other hand, or second, he looks at Zionism as an institution of power, an institutional power structure and practice that aims at two things: accumulation of wealth, land, power. That's Said's sort of Marxist subtext, right? Something that he struggled with, I think, in most of his writing. And also his Zionism as a project or technology of displacement, of dispersal of people, and other ideas and prior legitimacy. So, first of all, Said draws our attention to the Zionist technologies or strategies of accumulation and displacement in Palestine. This articulation of accumulation and displacement has evolved in what I referred to earlier as the ongoing Nakba. That whatever happened in 48 still continues on a daily basis in Palestine. What was going on in Palestine before Trump crashed the party, so to speak, was the slow, methodical process of depopulation, land confiscation, violation of every human rights in the book, mobility restrictions, house demolitions, detention, extrajudicial killings of youth. Nobody paid attention to or seemed to care about the Israeli ethnic cleansing campaign and the Likud Party's Central Committee colonialist policies of annexation of the West Bank. As long as Israel paid lip service to peace process, then everything was going really fine. Nobody really commented on this. But this is where what we need to do is document the daily processes of destruction that are going on in Palestine. Just to give you one brief example, when I come and go out of Bethlehem to my work, to visit my family in the north near Haifa, we sometimes take a little lovely road between the mountains, between Jerusalem and Bethlehem, called Wadi al-Walaja Valley. Now, Wadi al-Walaja had a checkpoint towards the end of it, just close to the borders of Jerusalem, basically to prevent Palestinians from entering into Jerusalem. Now, in the last couple of weeks, what we noticed, and my wife is here and daughter Salma are here with me as well, we were surprised. They are building a new barrier. They're moving the checkpoint, what they call barrier, and a literal translation from Hebrew, a few kilometers up the mountain east towards Bethlehem. Why? To restrict the movement of Palestinians even more. Like you could see some Palestinian families with, going around, husband, wife, children, going inside that area. It's really good to go and enjoy some of that area. Now they can't. It's really all the way up to the mountain where that restriction is going on. This is what we're talking about. Okay? That the ongoing Nakba clearly drives a nail in the coffin of the two-state solution and continues to strangle the everyday life of Palestinians. Perhaps it will eventually pave the way for an authentic one-state solution, I don't know. But perhaps it will just simply lead to that imperial state that we are all afraid of. Second, Said places Zionism in the larger colonial history and context of European imperial designs in the region. As many perspicacious observers have noted, Trump's November 2017 declaration in Jerusalem coincided, for better or worse, with the centennial commemoration of the Balfour Declaration. So if you look at what's going on, you have to go back and look at the larger colonial history in the Middle East, okay, which is really, again, disturbing. Maybe Trump didn't know, but the fact that they chose November was really something to think about. For some observers and media pundits, history simply repeats itself, as we see once again, to paraphrase Arthur Koestler's words, one nation solemnly promised to a second nation, in this case the capital city, or part of it, of a third. So history repeats itself. Now, what Said left out from his analysis of Zionism as a technology of accumulation and displacement in the context of Western imperial history is his reluctance to articulate a radical Marxist critique of the way in which Zionist primordial mythical claims that, the land of Israel belongs to the Jews, originated from there, the Palestinians have nothing, this is a land that has continuously been occupied or inhabited by Jews, therefore it belongs to us. Which Said, of course, many times simply said is really hard to understand because of its irrational, basis. There is a need to quote the Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek, as he writes, to articulate the underlying capitalist motive in the Palestinian struggle in a direct, non-displaced way, and which Said, for me, problematically did not address. Now, this history of the colonial project and the history of the Balfour Declaration was brought alive in Palestine, especially in Bethlehem, in Banksy, the British graffiti artist's work. If you heard about the hotel that he started in Bethlehem called the Waldorf Hotel. I have written a couple of pieces on it, you can check it out. It's an incredible monument that really commemorates the impact of the Balfour Declaration and everything that is going on in Palestine today in terms of apartheid politics, surveillance, everything else is framed within the history of the Balfour Declaration. Now, I mentioned this, and quickly we'll go on to my last point. When Said talks about the Balfour Declaration, he mentions specific people, interesting people, but he never mentions the name of Leopold Avery. When I was writing about Banksy and I was sort of researching the Balfour Declaration, I actually come across his name. He is the drafter of the Balfour Declaration that the historian William Rubenstein described as probably the most remarkable example of concealment of identity in 20th century political history. He stated it's no exaggeration to describe him as a secret Jew who worked tirelessly on behalf of Jewish causes. Because of his increasing significant political position, he was immensely influential in bringing about the success of the Zionist enterprise, which eventually led to the State of Israel. Actually, he bragged a lot about creating the army, the Israeli army. The last point I would like to mention, I have 5 minutes?
Yes.
Okay. The last point I want to mention is a disturbing, another disturbing development in the struggle for freedom in Palestine. When I was booking my flight to Reno, to check in actually, an ad popped up. It was called Zion and Oil. And I was like, what? Zion and oil? Oil like the Gulf countries, the Arab oil? Okay, so I looked at it, and it was actually a commercial for a company that drills oil in historical Palestine and in Israel in the name of some biblical prophecies about the blessings of the deep. Right? Go deep and get all of that oil. But the ad is uncanny to me because I've been writing about this and looking at another aspect of the Palestinian struggle today, which is the alliance that is going on between what Slavoj Žižek calls the new axis of evil, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. Okay, all of these countries, traditionally Muslim Arab countries who have rejected Israel and cooperation with Israel, that now cooperate with Israel because of the Iranian threat. So this was really incredible to me. So this alliance between Zion and oil strikes a chord in regional politics because it brings to the forefront a new breed of Zionism that I refer to as Islamo-Arabic Zionism. Do not be surprised. Okay, as we have recently seen, Arab governments have worked in cahoots with the Trump administration and the Israeli government on what is called the deal of the century. Mahmoud Abbas called it the slap of the century. This deal would grant autonomous status to certain parts of the West Bank under Jordanian tutelage, while putting Gaza under the Egyptian control. This deal would not only end any hopes for a two-state solution, it will liquidate the Palestinian struggle in exchange for formalizing relations with Israel in return for a military alliance against Iran. Now, this is the new subject that I'm going to talk about, the subject who is supposed to believe we're Zionists. Ilan has once said, most Zionists don't believe in God, but they believe He gave it to them. Okay? Israel actually has the most atheist people in the world, percentage of atheist people in the world. What is ironic about this? Two things to Ilan. One of the ironic things about it is that what's going on in the Middle East, especially when you talk about fundamentalism and the war on terror, is some sort of reversal of the role. Now you have, Zionist fundamentalists who believe in God or whatever, right? And you have Palestinians who are supposed to be the terrorists and the fundamentalists making claims in secular terms. Incredible. The way things have been changing. So, and this again, an idea that I borrowed from Slavoj Žižek. He writes, we have Arab fundamentalists arguing in secular terms, and Jewish secular Westerners relying on theological reasoning, which Said have long ago, as I said, found to be very hard to understand in its irrationality and mystification. Now, I love Ilan's work and respect it a lot, of course, but I would, based on Slavoj's work, I would argue that this observation about Zionists, who do not believe in God, still believe that God gave it to them, needs to supplement it by belief is reflexive. You need somebody else to believe for you. And Zionists found this believer, first of all, it was the Christian Zionists, who believe for Zionism. Many people thought about the millenarian attitude, the second coming or whatever, which many actually fundamentalist Christians would scoff at. They say, we believe in it because it's the fulfillment of a prophecy. It means that the Bible is good, what we believe in is good. But there's another subject now who emerged, who believe for Zionists, and that is the Muslim Arab subject. Pseudo-intellectuals in the Gulf, in particular in the Gulf, in Egypt, in Turkey, who believe for Zionism, who distort the Quran and the message of the Quran to simply say, like when the Quran mentions the Holy Land, it never says Palestine. They interpret it as being Palestine because their source for interpretation has always been Talmudic, right? Interpretation of the Bible. Muslims never had issues with Jews. Being a Jew is not an issue for Muslims. I said many Muslims. Let's say there are anti-Semitism that we need to fight anywhere. But there is something disturbing about distorting the facts. And again, part of the problem, the Palestinians didn't know that. And we would find many Palestinian imams and sheikhs and whatever quoting the Quran and the Bible because it was normal for them. For centuries they did that. Until, of course, it was politicized by the Zionist movement. Now the Holy Land has acquired a different meaning. So it's not just simply the Holy Land, it is Palestine. And I love actually an interpretation by one sheikh from, I think from Jerusalem, who wrote that based on interpretations of the Bible and the Quran, he believes that the Holy Land that God gave the Jews was actually in Saudi Arabia. So, who knows? I will conclude now. I know Anwar is looking at me. Come on, Jamil, finish. The ongoing Nakba remains completely ignored by mainstream media, which is invested in the failed peace talks and lip service to the two-state solution, which has been undermined in every turn by the conditions on the ground that Israelis have manufactured through the ongoing Nakba. In many ways, Trump has exposed the lies and behind-the-scenes agreements, if not conspiracies, not only at the core of Palestinian politics, but also at the core of Middle Eastern politics in general. Now it is up to us to change that. Thank you for listening.